In this section, we will focus on what plans were formed for Reconstruction and the eventual downfall of President Andrew Johnson. Now, as we go into Reconstruction here, one thing we have to do is look at where we're at as a country. We know that the Civil War has just finished, and it's going to end up being one of the bloodiest wars, the bloodiest war that the United States has ever fought. There's bad blood between the North and the South. The Southerners are not happy about losing the war, let alone the eventual plans that are going to come out to try to get them back into the Union. The Union doesn't want to just let the states come back, these states that rebelled. They want them back, but they need to figure out a plan that punishes them, but also allows for there to not be any resentment later on, because they don't want a South that hates the North, and the North doesn't want to hate the South anymore. We also know the slaves have been freed through the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, and that rebuilding must be done, that the country has to rebuild at some point here. So as we go through this debate, the first thing we need to remember is that the Confederacy is in ruins right now. The Confederacy has been destroyed by generals like Sherman, who marched and destroyed plantations, destroyed crops, destroyed cities. And also, we have to know that people wanted to get back to their lives. People have a short attention span, and once the war was over, they didn't want to dwell on it. A lot of people wanted to just get back to what they were doing before the war. War is a terrible thing, especially when it's fought here in the United States, in this country, and for Americans. And they want to get back to normal. They just want to get back to their lives. So Lincoln comes up with a plan, and Lincoln's plan is pretty simple. Number one, he's going to offer amnesty to all Southerners. And that means amnesty, meaning that they have kind of a pardon that goes along with them, and they have to take an oath of loyalty. Back then, this word of, your word is your bond type thing really takes hold. Secondly, the Confederate government and also high officials were not allowed to take the oath. And he's quoted as saying, "With malice towards none, with charity for all," meaning that he wants to go out the South, but he wants to have a moderate policy to reconcile with the South. He wants to not necessarily punish everybody. He wants the Union to be one again. Now, along this line comes the radical Republicans. We remember that the Republican Party is formed during the Civil War, and it is the party of Abraham Lincoln. Along comes a group, the radical Republicans, who do not feel that Lincoln is as harsh on the South as he should be, and they don't feel that he is necessarily taking the steps that they want. So they resist Lincoln's plan. Now there's some reasons. They wanted to revolutionize the South, and they had a couple ideas. They wanted no Confederate leaders in the South. They didn't feel that those that led the South should be allowed to be in power, because if those people get back in power in their minds, what's going to keep them then from seceding again later on? They also want a strong Republican influence in the South, and they figure a way they can do that, and their third point, to give equality to African Americans, former slaves. They're thinking that these people could gain them seats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and that's a big thing. They want former slaves to get into positions of power, but they also want to use them in their citizenship as a voting tool. And before this, it's the 3/5 compromise in the South, meaning that each African American who lives in the South is considered 3/5 of a citizen. By giving them full citizenship, that's a lot of extra people that are going to be down there. There's always another motive to this, and the voting is a big motive. And one thing that comes out is the Wade Davis bill out of this. And what happens are, there are radical Republicans, there are people that go along with Lincoln, but also there are these people in the middle. And they're not sure exactly where to stand. So the Wade Davis bill comes out, and it's a very, very moderate bill, meaning it's not necessarily completely Republican, not completely Democrat. It's a moderate bill. Both sides, those middle-of-the-road people, are supporting it. And they feel that a majority needs to take the oath, majority of people need to take the oath, that they abolish slavery, that the South needs to reject all war debts. So if something is owed to the South out of the war, they have to reject it and say, no, you don't owe us any money. Then also no old Confederates in office. And so if you look at this, it is a very moderate bill. It takes a little bit as far as giving African Americans their rights, but at the same time not going too far with that, and also punishing the South, but not to the likes that the radical Republicans maybe would have liked to have had happen. Now Lincoln says no. Lincoln vetoes it. He does not agree with this bill, and he sends it then to the signing. What he does something called a pocket veto, which is an indirect veto. He lets the session of Congress expire, and he never signs the bill. So although Lincoln doesn't sign the veto papers, he does in a way veto this bill. Now, there are some reforms that are happening in the South during this time. There's a group that is formed called the Freedmen's Bureau, and unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to go down in history as a group that is not necessarily the most revolutionary. But they did try, and some of the things they did, they gave land in Georgia and South Carolina to slaves. Now, unfortunately, what we're going to see happen is a lot of these slaves, we'll see this in future notes here, but a lot of the slaves didn't have the money to keep up with this land, and a lot of them ended up going back to becoming tenant farmers and sharecroppers, and in the end being workers on white Southerners' farms. And so it's a form of slavery, just not slavery, and we'll get to that in a later section. But they did give some land, and there was a famous promise made at one point of a number of acres given. That didn't necessarily pan out. Also, they used surplus army supplies for relief. The army had built up all these supplies of food and rations that they were able to then give out to not only blacks, but also to poor whites during this time. Because you have to understand there are a lot of people who went and fought who are coming back to either destroyed land, or they didn't really have a job or education coming out of the army. They're just kind of stuck. And also move to educate former slaves, get them reading in it. And this does actually start to gain some headway. Now, around this time, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and that causes a big problem because you have Lincoln's plan, and he was the big fighter of this kind of moderate policy, almost a lenient policy on the South. But Johnson ends up taking over. And Johnson he believes that moderate is the best way to bring the seceded states back. And he also wants to win Southern loyalty. So he doesn't want to come in being completely against the South because the South will vote, and he doesn't want to lose that vote either. So he has this moderate policy towards Reconstruction. He has a plan. Johnson has a plan going in. Johnson's plan basically says that we will pardon all former Confederates who take the oath. We will create a new constitution for states, those new states as they come in, and we will leave all those debts on the table. But this is the big part that hurts. The pardon all former Confederates. People don't necessarily like this. It's going to cause some problems. Meanwhile, in the South, we have to remember that these are former slave owners in a lot of cases who are now living amongst these slaves as citizens. And the black codes are formed. And these are laws and rules that, although aren't slavery or former slave laws where they change the word slave sometimes with black or Negro, and they're very, very bad laws, and there's no way around that. And so they limit African American rights, and we'll talk more about what rights are held down later on here. But they couldn't gain power. A lot of them didn't have land, and we see that this is going to cause some huge problems. The black codes are going to come back up in our future sections here, and we will talk about those more. Now, with Lincoln gone and the South really gaining ground, a lot of corruption down there, some radical Republicans get into power, and the radical Republicans end up taking over Congress. Not taking over the United States necessarily, but taking over Congress. And they start something called military Reconstruction. And because they control Congress, they're able to pass all these laws. Now, the South is turned into military districts. And there are 5 districts, and there are different generals that are in charge of each district. And what their ideas are is that new constitutions are going to be formed. They create something called the Tenure of Office Act, and they pass a bunch of sweeping reforms for former slaves, things like that. But this Tenure of Office Act is extremely important, and here's why. The Tenure of Office Act says that the president cannot fire cabinet officials without consent of Congress. Now, this doesn't seem like a sweeping revolutionary law, but you have to think like the Republicans were thinking at this time. They knew that Andrew Johnson wasn't on their side. They knew that if anybody went against what he was thinking, that Andrew Johnson would fire them. They also didn't want Andrew Johnson in as president, and they knew that if they baited him enough, he would take the bait, and that's exactly what he did. You ask, would this protect the radical Republicans from Johnson? It would. And of course Johnson's going to follow this, right? Well, we know that he is wrong. He will not follow it. You can see the thumbs down there. He does not like this plan. And here's what happens. He fires his Secretary of War. So Johnson fires his Secretary of War, which does not sit well. He breaks the Tenure of Office Act. That is breaking a law that has been put in. This leads to the impeachment process, the kicking out of the president by vote. And he is one vote shy of impeachment. He is very close to getting completely kicked out of office. He's one vote shy, but this basically secures that he will not get reelected. And eventually, down the line, this does jump a little bit, but all the states are eventually brought back into the Union. For a couple reasons. One, because the radical Republicans were finally able to pass laws, whether good or bad, they were able to pass laws that would bring these states back without the debate that was raging on. And also, people tend to not care anymore. As people go on, years and decades pass, people aren't too concerned with the South anymore. After a while, they kind of ignore what's going on. And this can come back to that analogy, or an analogy of your parents. If you and your sibling get in a fight, your mom and dad might say make up, and you might shake hands, and you're not necessarily happy with each other, but you kind of bury the hatchet for a little while and say okay, and eventually whatever you were fighting about just kind of goes away and you're friends again. And that's kind of what the United States does here, that the North and the South, they shake and make up. They don't really mean it, but eventually they just kind of forget what they were fighting about and ignore and move on, because this country is always moving forward. So the key points from this section that we should know is that there were many plans thought of for Reconstruction, some really good, some not as good. The Freedmen's Bureau attempted to change things for former slaves, number 2, and they did get some changes out there. Number 3, Johnson did not have a very good time in office and was eventually impeached, almost. And number 4, the radical Republicans eventually do take over Congress and force change in the South. The next section we will be doing is the Republican rule, and talking about as the Republicans were in charge, talking about what the South started to look like after the Civil War, and also start talking about some Southern resistance, because there are groups in the South that aren't necessarily going to like Reconstruction.